There are some franchises in the world that just have a handful of films and shows and yet have some of the messiest timelines because, well, you guessed it, they involve time travel. And suddenly you gotta open up Reddit and ask people for the chronological order. The Terminator franchise is one of these universes. With a total of just 6 films, they started out super strong with Terminator and T2 Judgment Day. But I think most fans would agree that things kind of fell apart with T3. And let's not even talk about the later films. So you can imagine the excitement of fans when they finally got a Terminator TV show that brought back the OG Sarah Connor and gave the original 2 films a worthy continuation. Hell, most people straight up rejected T3 after Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles came out. And it ran for 2 glorious seasons before ultimately getting canceled. And the saddest part is that it couldn't even finish the story it started to tell, leaving fans absolutely heartbroken. Like, we were literally just stranded in the middle of the sea. It's even worse when you find out that they didn't actually run out of ideas, they had a whole plan in place. So today, we're diving into exactly what happened to the Sarah Connor Chronicles, and how, why it started, and most importantly, how it ended. Or rather, what could have been. It will get you feeling all nostalgic again, guys, so maybe prepare for a rewatch. And let's get started. Okay, so let's start right from the beginning. Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, first aired on Fox on January 13th, 2008, arriving as a mid-season replacement. But the actual stroke of genius, which could have totally been a coincidence, was that the premiere ended up being scheduled right after an NFL playoff game. And this led to a whopping 18.3 million viewers. And let me tell you, those are some crazy numbers. Now, the creative team behind the whole show was also really solid. While James Cameron himself was no longer associated, we had Josh Friedman as the writer and executive producer, and credit to him because he did such a good job. And the whole reason for creating the TV show was because of Sarah Connor. She was the main character of the franchise and was supposed to be an integral part of the entire trilogy. In fact, she was supposed to feature in Terminator 3, but Linda Hamilton ultimately declined to return, and Sarah was written out. And we as an audience didn't even get to see her, as she died of leukemia before T3's events. James Middleton, an executive producer of the show, came up with the TV show idea because of this. He said, after T3 came out, I started to miss Sarah. I kept thinking, how could we bring her back? Even Friedman said that the main reason for bringing the show was to give the fans a more satisfying ending, one that still has Sarah in the picture. And thus, the plot of the show started falling into place. We had Sarah being played by Lena Headey, who you might know better as the infamous Queen Cersei. Thomas Dekker took on the role of a teenage John Connor, and Summer Glau was Cameron. Fun fact, Cameron was actually a tribute to none other than James Cameron, who wrote and directed the first 2 Terminator films. Now, if you remember what happened in Terminator 2, Sarah and John had successfully infiltrated the Cyberdyne Systems HQ and even stopped the creation of Skynet, which was the super advanced AI system that was supposed to launch a nuclear war on humans in the future and bring about Judgment Day. In fact, John was destined to lead the human resistance against Skynet and the machines. But because of Sarah and John, and, of course, Schwarzenegger's T-800, the entire end of the world scenario is averted, and it seems like Judgment Day is long gone. But boy, were they wrong. This is where Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles picks up, and they realize all they did was maybe delay Judgment Day a little. The show picks up in 1999, just 4 years after Terminator 2, and Sarah and John are once again on the run. And this time there's a Terminator T-888 called Cromartie that's been sent from the future to kill John. There's also another Terminator, Cameron, who's there to protect John, sent by future John. You gotta keep up with all these time shenanigans, guys. There's also an FBI agent, James Ellison, in the mix, who's after Sarah Connor, and despite all this going on, the Connor duo had only one job in mind: stop Judgment Day, which was now supposed to happen in 2011. However, despite having all of this in place and the first season approved, the show ran into some real problems. You see, the show was actually one of 7 new shows that were being approved for that year, and season 1 of Sarah Connor Chronicles was given the green light with a total of 13 episodes. But then came the Writers Guild of America strike that derailed all their plans. The whole ordeal lasted from November 2007 to February of 2008, and unfortunately by that time they only had fully shot 7 of the 13 episodes. They still tried to continue things and shot 2 episodes during the strike, but ultimately they had to slash the number of episodes from 13 to 9 because there was simply no way for them to finish the remaining scripts. And Friedman at that time didn't even stay present for the production so as not to take advantage of the unemployed writers. Instead, as the show premiered during that tumultuous time, Friedman spent his hours cruising message boards to read what people were saying online about what worked and what didn't and how he could improve future episodes. But this whole reduction of episodes did have a much larger ripple effect on the show. You see, Friedman was actually super ambitious with his writing of the first season. There was a shit ton of things he wanted to pack in storyline-wise, such as it almost seemed over-ambitious. Things became even tougher when the episodes got slashed, and so many of the planned storylines had to be let go of. Friedman himself speaks of this and how the final version of Season 1 just couldn't cover everything they wanted to. Eventually, some of those narratives had to either just be abandoned or smoothly shifted over to Season 2. Friedman has also discussed how at least one fully conceived episode essentially became a lost episode. Friedman said, "I think what happens is that you try to be very ambitious with each episode. You want to tell this A story, this B story, and then see if you can sneak in a little of the C and D story, and by the time you're halfway down the alphabet, you're out of 43 minutes. So you end up cutting stuff and you end up cutting entire storylines. And I think that becomes a little problematic. What I want to do this year is within each episode try and tell fewer stories but tell them more in depth, so no one storyline is on the chopping block. That happened to a lot of the high school stuff last year, and that's why it was always a storyline that we had going on, but it was never the highest priority. When we were trying to decide between more Sarah or more high school intrigue, we always settled on more Sarah. So the high school stuff went away because we rarely committed to it as a large block of the story. Fortunately, despite this major snafu, the show was approved for a second season, which then premiered on September 8th, 2008, and ultimately ran for a whole 22 episodes, with a series finale on April 10th, 2009. Now we come to a very important thing to understand before moving on to the ending, and that is the timeline of the whole show. Most of you who watch the show and follow the franchise will already know this. Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, wasn't actually a continuation of the trilogy after Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. It was more like a reinvention of the trilogy. In fact, Sarah Connor Chronicles was set after the events of Terminator 2 as an alternate ending to the trilogy. It basically disregarded whatever BS T3 tried to sell us and give us a proper ending. At least they tried to. Which means that Sarah Connor Chronicles goes down as its own separate timeline, almost like an alternative Terminator 3. Also important to note is that this show doesn't relate or feed into any of the other films either, like Salvation, Genesis, or Dark Fate. And Friedman in particular had a lot to say about this timeline thing. He said, "We're gonna go off on our own. I think the thing about T3 is obviously there was just no Sarah Connor, and that's something the fans were never happy with. I don't even think people who made T3 were happy with that. It just wasn't a choice of theirs. You know, Linda Hamilton was going through some things and didn't want to be a part of it. They had a script at one point, I know, but there was a T3 that had Sarah in it. I've never read it. I don't know anything about it, but I know that they did, and they wanted to do that. They wanted it to kind of be her trilogy, and it never could be. So I think that my feeling was that this TV series, to me, sort of serves as the third act to that trilogy. What could have happened had we followed that after T2? So I almost think of this as T3. To me, it takes the place of T3. But also, I think that's sort of in the spirit of Terminator, it's an alternate timeline. I know a lot of people get very worked up about the continuity and the canon and all that stuff. What I try to do is stay very, very true to the first two movies and then sort of take it from there. But I always remain true to the spirit of everyone's intent and again, take some time with this woman and explore what maybe would have happened. And when he was asked if there was any chance Sarah would end up with leukemia, his reply was particularly hilarious. He said you should not expect her to get leukemia in season 3. Unless Lena really pisses him off. It's good to see that she didn't. And since we're talking about Lena Headey here, she was actually a very specific choice by Friedman and the team. They wanted somebody who could really embody Sarah Connor rather than just some glammed up Hollywood actress who felt nothing for the role. And who better than Lena Headey, who had taken boxing lessons and trained in the sport with some next level grit and strength. Alright guys, now we're finally going to discuss the ending and the finale episode of season 2, which was episode 22 titled Born to Run. So here are some major spoilers from here on, so please proceed at your own risk. The episode starts where the previous one left off. Sarah Connor had been arrested after Derek's death and was being questioned by FBI agent Aldridge about a string of crimes connected to her. And hey, from the FBI's point of view, I don't blame them. Sarah does indeed have a record of being associated with some really sus situations. They've connected her to Miles Dyson's death because she was at the scene of the whole Cyberdyne explosion. Of course, we know she didn't kill him, but that doesn't really matter. She and her son had also been implicated in the bank explosion. And of course, they're also pinning the kidnapping of Savannah Weaver, who's the daughter of none other than Catherine Weaver of Xeria Corp, on her. He also wanted her to help them locate and bring in her son. But if there's anything we know about Sarah, she's a fiercely protective mother. John, on the other hand, is hiding out in a motel with Cameron, feeling helpless for his mother, who's not only arrested, but was also predicted to get cancer in the future. We also see Catherine Weaver, who's busy training and perfecting John Henry, another AI who's in the Terminator body of Cromartie after the body was salvaged, following the Connors destroying it because it was after them. Now, all these characters and pieces in play eventually converge at Catherine Weaver's Xeria Corp operation, after John Connor orchestrates Sarah's escape from prison with the help of Cameron and John Henry himself. In this final climax, we have a huge revelation that subverts all our expectations, as Catherine Weaver reveals her plans and doings. You see, Catherine Weaver herself was a Terminator, a T-1001, who had taken the place of the actual head of the Zaria Corporation, the human Catherine Weaver. But as it turns out, Weaver was using Zaria Corp to develop an AI meant to oppose Skynet. She wasn't actually trying to create Skynet as the Connors thought. Instead, she was creating John Henry to combat Skynet. Think about Tony Stark's creative vision to fight Ultron. John Henry was actually supposed to be an ally, helping Connor in the fight against their common enemy, Skynet. And just as all of them have more or less made up and are all on the same side, things fall apart yet again as they stumble upon a lifeless Cameron. You see, Cameron was sent to kill John Henry at the behest of the Connors. But before she meets him, Weaver sends Cameron an oddly simple yet devastating question through Ellison. Will you join us? So what does Cameron do? When she later comes face to face with John Henry, she gives up her CPU chip to him so that he can use the time displacement equipment to time travel into the future and embrace his life's mission. And the moment John and Weaver find Cameron deactivated, he's determined to go after John Henry into the future and get back Cameron's CPU. Unfortunately, Sarah Connor decides to stay back and try to stop the creation of Skynet in the present. She and John share a touching goodbye as she's left behind by her son. We should have known something like this would happen because Lena Headey herself said, I think that we're going to see a lot more of John taking control and then becoming and making steps towards becoming the man he has to be to take on his tasks. And I think this season for Sarah is kind of her losing slight control over everything pretty much. And my feeling is that I think there's a slow madness sort of happening in her because she feels that everything's kind of out of reach right now. So, John and Weaver travel to the future, and here too we get another shocking ending. John Connor, who is destined to become the leader of the human resistance in the future, finds his entire fate has changed. I guess that's what happens when you mess with the past. The butterfly effect also changes the future. You see, in this future, John Connor was no longer known as the resistance leader. Yeah, Judgment Day still had happened, but John wasn't at the center of it all. In fact, John comes across many of his allies like Derek Reese, who had been killed before the finale, or even Kyle Reese, who is his own father and is alive in the future. But none of them seem to recognize him or even know who he is. He even meets Allison Young, who is a human resistance fighter, upon whom Cameron's Terminator body was based. But even she doesn't have any clue about who he is. By going forward in time and skipping the entire journey of becoming a resistance leader, he arrives in a future where that legendary identity hasn't been established. Nobody knows him as John Connor, the resistance leader, and that's where the show ends. It leaves us with the question of what would happen to humanity if John Connor never becomes John Connor. It wasn't the worst ending, but Friedman knew there was more to the story, but he did as much as he could. Here's what he had to say. I was sad that we were canceled. I wanted to do more, but I also felt satisfied personally. I didn't want it to just feel like the needle had been pulled off the record suddenly. I wanted it to feel like the song had ended, even if the album hadn't.
Get down.
But was that supposed to be the ending? Well, it's pretty clear from Friedman's statements that Born to Run was never supposed to be the ending, but he knew that there was a very real possibility that they wouldn't get a season 3. That's why he tried to make the finale as much of a final as possible, you know? Now here's what he had to say about it. I wrote a season 2 finale, and I thought there was a good chance that that was going to be the end. I wanted to write something that sat astride an ending emotionally, and yet would allow us to do something if we did get a season 3. I wanted to write an episode that was like, be careful what you wish for. John loves Cameron, but it's like Pinocchio. She's not a real girl. Okay, so what if he met the real human that Cameron Terminator was based on? John never likes being John. He doesn't like the burden of the mantle. So what happens if he gets his wish? He shows up in the future, he gets to meet his dad, meet the girl he couldn't have but in human flesh, and nobody knows who he is. So he has no pressure. So it felt like it could end there, but that it wouldn't. So the ending was kind of like a cliffhanger, but also not. It depends on how you want to view it. All about perspective, I guess. Even Summer Glau said, I think everybody's going to be shocked about what happens at the end of this season. It's not the ending. But let's be very clear on one thing. Sarah Connor Chronicles was canceled, not concluded. Friedman had a rough idea for 4 whole seasons, and he definitely had plans for at least a 3rd season. But the finale aired on April 10th, 2009, and the cancellation announcement was made by Fox on May 18th, 2009. Fox president Kevin Riley said, "We make no apologies for that show. We did a huge launch with that show. We tried. It was time to move on." The reason behind the cancellation wasn't any massive conspiracy either. The show had decently positive reviews, but the viewership had just been steadily dropping as time went by, especially with the 2nd season. Even after the initial premiere, which got a bunch of views because of the timing, viewership slowly started to drop to 10 million viewers with episode 2 and eventually around 7 million towards the end of season 1. Season 2 premiered with only like 6 million viewers, so the graph just kept dipping downward. And then eventually the final nail in the coffin was when it was moved to a Friday slot known as the death slot, and viewership dropped as low as 2.9 million. And that's pretty much why it was eventually canceled. When Friedman was asked if there was any possibility for the show to be picked up by another cable network, he didn't have any hopes for that either. He said, "It's not an expensive show, it's very average in terms of its costs, but it's more expensive than all cable shows. There are limited places for a show like this, I think. I know it's harsh, but I can't imagine a scenario where we'll ever be more than TSCC in any form. We have what we have." And boy, did that statement break hearts. Because even though the whole ratings drop painted a particular picture, this show had a whole bunch of hardcore fans. And those fans started a whole campaign to try and get Fox to renew the show. The petitions and campaign even continued up until 2015. Even Josh Leaves of CNN wrote an online commentary to convince and urge Fox not to cancel the show. And during the cancellation, there was a particularly interesting battle that had happened. You see, Sarah Connor Chronicles wasn't the only show on the chopping block. It turns out Fox had 2 Friday night sci-fi programs that were struggling to stay on the air: Sarah Connor Chronicles and Joss Whedon's Dollhouse. Wired even ran a fan poll of Sarah Connor versus Dollhouse, while the futures of both shows were uncertain. Of course, eventually Sarah Connor Chronicles was canceled while Dollhouse was renewed for a second season. And this is so sad because season 3 had some really solid plans in place. I already mentioned that from very early on, Friedman had a rough idea of what he wanted over the course of 4 seasons. Of course, things did change, and even the first 2 seasons are very different from what he'd originally conceptualized. But he essentially thought of Judgment Day as something inevitable, and he would eventually build up to it. Now, initially, when Friedman was asked about the possible storyline for season 3, he pretty much straight up said that he wasn't going to reveal anything, and even asked the other writers involved not to give anything away. He wanted fans to make up the ending whatever they wanted to, keep it open-ended. But eventually, people spilled the tea, and we got a whole bunch of clues. We found out from Decker that season 3 would have mainly focused on John Connor trying to establish himself in the new post-apocalyptic timeline where no one knew it. He would slowly build relationships with Kyle Reese and Derek Reese and rise up the ranks of the Resistance. Another very interesting storyline would have been between John and Allison. John had already clearly developed some feelings for Cameron by the season 2 finale, so naturally he would have had some attraction or romantic connection with Allison Young, who was literally the human counterpart of Cameron. And that conflict between his developing feelings for Allison and his mission to bring Cameron's CPU would have been very interesting to see. He also would have ended up coming across Savannah Weaver, who would have been an adult by then and an active fighter in the human resistance. Decker even sort of hinted at some new additions, like Danny Dyson would be a recurring character, and then we would also get to see a much older Sarah who survived Judgment Day. Of course, that wouldn't have been the only timeline. We would have also had a parallel timeline, aka the present, which would explore Sarah's fate and future. And I'm sure FBI agent Aldridge would have also played a decent role there, either as an enemy or an ally, who knows. Sarah was obviously wrong about Catherine Weaver, which means that she would need some solid storylines and clues to get her back on track to stopping Skynet. But honestly, everything's pretty much speculation, and we'll never get solid answers. But now, more than a decade later, it's time to accept it and cherish the fact that at least we got something other than T3. The good thing is that Sarah Connor Chronicles had consequences far beyond its 2 seasons. No, not in terms of the Terminator franchise, but rather for the careers of the actors involved. Lena Headey, of course, just a few years after the series ended, became Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones, which literally made her an international star. Thomas Decker went on to act in films and shows like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Kaboom, The Secret Circle, and Backstorm. Summer Glau actually remained quite connected with the whole sci-fi genre and took up roles in Dollhouse, Alphas, and Arrow. But of course, Cameron was just peak performance, along with River Tam from Firefly and Serenity. Brian Austin Green, on the other hand, continued his television career with Desperate Housewives, Anger Management, and the Beverly Hills 90210 revival, BH 90210. And then Garen Dillahunt, who played both Cromartie and John Henry, found roles in Raising Hope and Fear the Walking Dead. Richard T. Jones, who's become quite the recognizable face now if you've ever watched The Rookie, which recently came out on Netflix as well, landed the role of Sergeant Wade Gray in the show. And as someone who watches it and is glad it got renewed, he does a really good job on it. Finally, last but not least, Shirley Manson, after giving a great performance on TV, returned to her career in music. Now, after all this talk of Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, you might be wondering, where do I go after this? What do I watch? Well, it depends on what question you're asking. If you want to watch something that acts as a continuation to the Sarah Connor Chronicles, you're going to be disappointed because there's nothing there. There's no canon episodes or shows or movies or comics that continue from where Friedman left off. So story-wise, Born to Run is the end. But if you just want some Terminator fun, then you can move on to Terminator Salvation, which actually, funnily enough, was released the same month that the show was canceled, and followed the movie continuity rather than the TV series plotlines. Then came the next 2 films, Terminator Genisys and Terminator Dark Fate, which once again did not treat Sarah Connor Chronicles as canon and continued with the film franchise. And then there was the 2024 Netflix anime Terminator Zero, which introduced a new story built around the franchise's branching timeline idea. So, go ahead and take your pick, but none of them will be able to give you the closure you want. Sarah Connor Chronicles took a franchise that was well established and actually tried to reinvent it. In fact, scratch that. It didn't just try, it succeeded. It continues the story of Sarah, which is exactly what all of us wanted. And it took the bold decision of changing John's future entirely. What would we not give to see their vision of season 3 and 4 and to watch John's growing power? But that's just not in the cards, unfortunately. Who knows, maybe John in some timeline has embraced his freedom from his burdensome destiny and simply retrieves Cameron's chip to save her. What do you guys think? Where would season 3 have led us? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to smash that like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to our channel, and make sure to ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next marvelous video. We'll see you in the next one.